we stopped. That's where we are tonight.
I did read the right stuff.
We, in chapter 8, we just go through all these battles that David had. You know, he was the Douglas MacArthur of the Old Testament, if you know who Douglas MacArthur is. And he just was forever in battles, and God gave him victory after victory after victory. In verse 13, chapter 8, verse 13, David built a victory monument in his return from defeating the Arameans. He became famous when he came back from that. Just continues talking about all these names. And like I said, if you're reading these Old Testament passages, don't get hung up on the names. Nobody else is going to know how they're pronounced, and you don't really need to. The thing is to see how God was working with David all the way through all these battles. And God gave him the victory. Lori was saying, I didn't know they had that many people back there that could keep killing all those people. But there were many other nations, many other groups. I want us to skip over to chapter 9. There's this really cool story about a young man named Mephibosheth. And if I ever get another cat, I'm going to call it Mephibosheth. I just love that word. Can't imagine it for a dog, but I think it'd be a cool name for a cat. So go to 2 Samuel chapter 9. Let's see, I'll read for a while and then somebody can pick up when I tell you where I stopped. David asked, is anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Do you remember back when Jonathan and David were making all these pledges and promises? It wasn't just to one another, it was also to their families, their families. So it's kind of like David's been in all these battles, and all of a sudden he goes, oh, wait a minute. Is there anybody left I need to be taken care of? Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They called him to appear before David, and the king said, are you Ziba? Your servant, he replied. Is there no one still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba said, there's still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled at both feet. Where is he? He's at the house of Micah, son of so-and-so and so-and-so. So David had him brought from Lo-Debar to the house of so-and-so. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth, your servant. Don't be afraid, David said, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. Why did he have to say, don't be afraid?
David said that.
Why did David say to this young man, don't be afraid, I'm going to take care of you?
Warrior, dude.
Well, he was a warrior. Everybody knew he was a warrior. What else?
He was a stranger.
He was a stranger to him. David was the king.
Yeah, I would say no.
Mephibosheth was the grandson of Saul, the last king. So Mephibosheth, if things had worked like they did in that culture, David would have called him forth to kill him. So there would be no one else in the line of Saul to try to take over. See, that gets kind of lost in the story sometimes. Don't be afraid, verse 7, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Why is he having to make sure he has a table to eat at?
Because it's a great honor, I think.
It would be an honor. What did they say about Mephibosheth when they asked about him? Was he a star athlete? Was he a warrior? Did he have a problem?
He was handicapped.
He was handicapped. He was crippled in his feet. And then again, in this culture, remember, being like this, he couldn't go into the temple and all that kind of thing. In this culture, when you had something going on like that, it was very hard to have a living, to make a living of any kind. So it was more than just saying, you know, come on, I'll feed you. It was like saying, I know you need, and I'm going to take care of you. Mephibosheth bowed down. What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? A dead dog like me. What does that tell you about Mephibosheth?
Didn't have much self-worth.
Didn't have much self-worth, self-confidence, because his family was gone and he himself was a cripple. 2 Samuel chapter 9. Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I've given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. I think it's interesting here they put in that this guy had 15 sons and 20 servants. So it wasn't like he was going to have to go out and work the crops by himself. He was actually providing now for a whole family by giving them back that land and telling them to work it. Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. He had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table and he was crippled in both feet. Kind of interesting how it has to recap that.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, in case you forgot. In case you forgot. But one of the reasons I wanted us to look at that chapter was to see how David was keeping that promise, those pledges that he and Jonathan made to one another, not just to watch out for each other, but to watch out for the family of. I just think that says, we know a lot of good things about David. He did a lot of not good things, but this is something about his character. Not only did he seek this young man out, not only did he say, come eat at my table, but he provided for his upkeep, if you will, for his livelihood by giving him back that land. David didn't have to give back that land. When you conquered somebody, when you took over as the king, you got everything the other king had. And so he was being abundantly gracious. So we've got some more fighting going on in chapter 10. But we get to chapter 11, and this is one of the interesting stories in the life of David. There's not a little shepherd boy in this story. There's not a sweet, nice, little, kind man, necessarily. What do you know about the story of David and Bathsheba?
She was married.
She was married to Uriah the Hittite. What else?
She got pregnant.
She got pregnant.
From David.
From David. You know, it's kind of like a soap opera.
Right. That's what I was thinking.
There's only one soap opera that I've watched over the last 50 years, and that's Days of Our Lives. And Patty was at our house yesterday because the puppies were getting groomed, and it was on. And I don't get to watch it very many days of the week, but I was watching it. It was the worst acting in 50 years I've ever seen. So here's Patty laughing at it, here's Joanna laughing at it, and I'm embarrassed. But you know, none of those stories could top what we're going to see here in this chapter 11.
Wow. I was shocked.
11:1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, you know, it's like they didn't fight in the bad weather. But when the weather got nice, oh, let's go to war. David sent Joab out to the king with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. Now he sends them out. He's not out there with them right now. Did you notice that? But David remained in Jerusalem. Verse 2. Here it goes. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Now, Hittite was not his last name. He was not an Israelite. He was like a mercenary, if you want, fighting with David's troops.
Her husband.
Her husband. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. What is that talking about?
Her cycle.
Right. When women, Jewish women in that culture, when they had their period, they then had to go through a period of purification after they had finished their period. Now, if you know a whole lot about female biology, you know that perhaps she may not have been in a position to get pregnant at that time if she was not in that fertile period, but this story doesn't go into a lot of that. She came to him and he slept with her. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I'm pregnant."
You a daddy.
How does she know it's his, not? How does she know it's his and not her husband's?
Well, her husband, in the next verse we find out, has been off at war.
He's been gone.
He's been away. He's been away. Send me Uriah the Hittite. So Uriah comes in, and David asks him how the war's going, and he says, go on down to your house for a while and visit with your wife. Take some R&R. But Uriah, because he was a good soldier, slept, verse 9, at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. If his other troops, his other fellow soldiers couldn't go home and visit their families, he wasn't going either, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind of soldier he was. Well, that didn't work. Uriah said to David, the ark of Israel are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I'll not go do such a thing. Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I'll send you back. He still didn't do it. He even tried to, David's invitation, Uriah ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah again went out and slept with his master's servants. He didn't go home. Boy, how the story would have been different if Uriah had gone home, perhaps. So what does he do now to Uriah, since he won't go home and cover for David, if you will? Yeah, he gets a hold of his commander and says, I want you to put Uriah the Hittite on the front line. Chances are in this kind of battle, this kind of war, you didn't survive the front line, because that's where you were the closest to all the fighting. Verse 16, so while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah in a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sends him a message, sends David a message. When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? If he asks you this, then say to him, also your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. If David was upset about losing troops and might get mad, why would he calm down when the messenger told him Uriah was dead? Because that's what he wanted to happen. He was setting Uriah up.
Right.
You know, we think all these sneaky, if you will, things happen just today, but this stuff's been going on forever. Going on down through verses 22, 23, 24, tells him he's dead. 25, David told the messenger, say this to Joab, don't let this upset you, and the sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. But basically what he was sending back to say, yeah, you did the right thing. You did what I asked you. So then very quickly, if you look at verses 26 and following, Bathsheba finds out Uriah's dead. So what does she do? David brings her to his house and she becomes his wife. David had a ton of wives. If you go back through here and start writing down all the wives David had. Now, I will say this. At this time, in this culture, when her husband had died, she was without anything. That left her without any name, any protection, any money, anything that Uriah had owned disappeared or went back to his family. So it's not like she suddenly danced over to David's house and became his wife. Some of this was survival. She became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Because until you get to that verse, you go, well, now David's this great and wonderful guy, and God's been with him all this time. God was not pleased with this turn of events. We're back to another prophet when we get to verse 12, Nathan. And again, just to kind of remind you that for a prophet, no matter how godly, how God sent, to go and tell the king something the king didn't like was putting his life in danger. It's putting his life in danger. You know, the king, even if it was David, if it was Saul, whomever, they still had the authority, if you will, to kill a prophet. So Nathan, I think, is probably thinking, what am I going to do? This just wasn't right. I can't just go up to the king and say, man, you messed up. You have sinned. So like so often happens, he turns it into a story. Again, I go back to the Golden Girls. Sophia, little white purse. Picture this. Jerusalem, 15 years ago. Switching over to the Message, but chapter 12. But God was not at all pleased with what David had done, and sent Nathan to David, and Nathan said to him, there were two men in the same city, one rich, one poor. The rich man had huge flocks of sheep, herds of cattle. The poor man had nothing but one little female lamb, which he had bought and raised. It grew up with him and his children as a member of his family. It ate off his plate. Oh, Rudy's not the only one. It ate off his plate and drank from his cup and slept on his bed. It was like a daughter to him. Let's hear like the little violins, music in the background. One day a traveler dropped in on the rich man. He was too stingy to take an animal from his own herds or flocks to make a meal for this visitor. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared a meal to set before his guest. Now again, we go back to that culture where you provide for the stranger. Somebody stops by your house and you're obligated to provide for them. David exploded in anger, as surely as God lives. The man who did this ought to be lynched. He must repay for the lamb 4 times over for his crime and his stinginess. One of the most courageous statements I believe in the Bible is when Nathan, I can see him just kind of taking a deep breath, you're the man. You're the man. It gives me chills. You're the man. And here's what God, the God of Israel, has to say to you. I made you king over Israel. I freed you from the fist of Saul. I gave your master's daughter and other wives to have and to hold. I gave you both Israel and Judah, and if that hadn't been enough, I'd gladly thrown in much more. So why have you treated the word of God with brazen contempt, doing this great evil? You murdered Uriah the Hittite. Now, I've often wondered, how did Nathan know that Uriah the Hittite, that his death was murder?
He's a prophet.
He's a prophet, so maybe God revealed it to him. You wonder how secret this was. You know, gossip's everywhere.
Well, he sent messages too.
And he sent messages back and forth, so who knows who told what. But Nathan heard about it. Then took his wife as your wife. Worse, you killed him with an Ammonite sword. And now because you treated God with such contempt and took Uriah the Hittite's wife as your wife, killing and murder will continually plague your family. This is God speaking, remember. I'll make trouble for you out of your own family. I'll take your wives from right out in front of you. I'll give them to some neighbor, and he'll go to bed with them openly. You did your deed in secret. I'm doing mine where the whole country is watching. Now, without reading the next verse, how do you think David might have reacted to that?
Like freaked out.
Could have been freaked out. What else? See, that's the good part. He confessed. Most of us, when we're caught on something, if you don't want to think about it as an adult, think about when you're a kid and you get caught. You have a couple of choices. You can deny it. You can blame it on somebody else. I'm not sure how he had blamed all this on anybody else. You can blame it on somebody else. You can just get mad. Or you can say, I did it. Verse 13, then David confessed to Nathan, I have sinned against God. And the good verse is the next one when it says, Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die. But because by doing this you've made enemies of the Lord, you've made the enemies of the Lord show contempt. The the son born to you will die. I don't understand. I don't like that result. That's what the story says. And part of the problem with this was it wasn't just between David and Uriah, it wasn't just between David and Bathsheba, it wasn't even just between David and Nathan, but according to this, everybody knew about it. Everybody knew about it. And when they knew about it with David, that cast aspersions on David's God, because David was seen so as the king that God had chosen. We don't often realize when we do things, the ripple effect. When I was pastoring in California, I got invited to a party one night. And it was this people in the church, I knew them. And I remember being outside because there was a big lemon tree. I just walked into a big old lemon hanging there. And all of a sudden I began to smell something kind of different. And I realized that a good bit of the people at the party were smoking pot. Now, it's not up to me to judge, boo, hiss. But the person that I was with, I went to her and I said, we need to go. And she said, why? And I said, because I'm of the generation that you can get in a lot of trouble for doing that. And if somebody would call the police on this gang, it wouldn't be 15 people arrested. It'd be 14 people, and Reverend Catherine Houchins, pastor of MCC Ventura. You know, so I wasn't boo-hissing what they were doing. It's just I wanted to protect the church and protect the witness of God. Have you ever noticed when somebody gets in trouble, if they've got any connection to a church, in the paper it says, you know, they were a Sunday school teacher, they were an usher, they were the pastor. And for a lot of people, that makes them question the church. My dad, who was not a church person, if he was listening to the radio on Sunday morning and he heard this preacher saying, we greet you this morning in the name of the Lord, and he knew that guy had taped it the day before, he'd call him a liar. And he wouldn't have anything to do with it. So Nathan was trying to point out to David, it wasn't just Bathsheba or Uriah, but it was God's witness. We'll go on, and it does happen that this child is killed, is taken. And verse 24, David confronted his wife, and he went to her and lay with her. She gave birth to another son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him. Because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah, which is Hebrew for God's beloved. Wasn't that the name of the president in West Wing, Jedediah? I don't know, I watched it. So the battles continue, they go on and on and on and on. You know, it's in some ways, David's crime with Uriah looked like the perfect crime, because people were killed in battle all the time. And probably, in a lot of ways, nobody would have ever said anything about it. But God knew. And God put it on the heart of Nathan to go and confront David. We're going to skip some of these chapters. I encourage you to read the story of Tamar, because it's some of the horrible parts of things that happened in the Bible. Absalom, David's son, comes back. A lot of things happen to those folks. They end up, Absalom, I think, is the one who was riding under the tree. He had long hair, got caught in the tree, and he ended up hanging, breaking his neck, which when I taught in Christian schools is what they told kids why they shouldn't have long hair, because of what happened to Absalom. Strange, I know. Skip on over, actually, to chapter 22. So much of this in between is David fighting this group and David fighting that group. The grief over the loss of his son. Things happen with famine and pestilence. All kinds of things break out. When we get to chapter 22, David sang to the Lord the words of this psalm. Before we do that, stop. Turn to Psalm 51.
What?
Mm-hmm. After Nathan confronted David, Psalm 51 is believed to be the psalm that David wrote following that. So that we don't think that David just said quickly, oh golly, I'm sorry, and didn't feel it any deeper. Because the story, as you read it in Samuel, it kind of gets moved on. He was upset and confessed and moved on. But supposedly, this is a psalm that was written around that time. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgression. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me. Against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth and sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Surely you desire truth in the inner parts. You teach me wisdom in the inmost place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Verse 10, create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. On that verse, do not cast me from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Why do you think he was using those terms? Had that happened to anybody in his experience? Remember when Saul got out of line and God actually took God's spirit from Saul? So David realized he had massively messed up. So it was legitimate for him to think, oh golly, I hope God doesn't take that spirit from me. But this is a beautiful psalm, and I encourage you to go out and finish reading it sometime, simply because it shows David's heart. It wasn't just a matter of he got caught, oh, I'm sorry, let's go on. There's some really gut-wrenching parts in that psalm. Chapter 22. David sang to the Lord the words of this song, and the Lord delivered him from the hand of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. It's kind of interesting in the story, all of a sudden they put in some of David's psalm, if you will, some of his songs. Just going to look at just a few of these verses. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, and the horn of my salvation. Think about who's saying this now, this great and mighty soldier. Is he talking about how strong he is? Is he talking about what a good shot he is? Is he talking about how massively he gets people to follow him? To whom does he give the credit for what he's been able to do? To God. The Lord is the rock of my salvation. That really hit me this weekend and today when I was looking at this, because sometimes we think it's all about us. That we have to do it all. And we have to figure it all out. And if we don't do it, something's going to happen. And we kind of forget that who's behind all this. Who's behind all this? Skip over to verse 17. God reached down from on high and took hold of me, drew me out of deep waters, rescued me from my powerful enemies, from my foes who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. He didn't rescue David because David had done all the right things. We just read he didn't do all the right things. Why did he rescue David? Because he delighted in it. He loved him. He was able to see all of David's life. We just get to see some of the good, some of the bad, but God was able to see all of them. Look at verse 21. I want to read this in the Message. God made my life complete when I placed all the pieces before him. When I cleaned up my act, he gave me a fresh start. Indeed, I've kept alert to God's ways. I haven't taken God for granted. Every day I review the way he works. I try not to miss a trick. I feel put back together, and I'm watching my step. God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to his eyes. I think that's just beautiful. Just beautiful, the restoration of God at work in our lives. You ever felt like everything's just a mess? All the pieces are broken up, nothing's working right? Go to the garden, eat worms. just that kind of thing. And yet David says, my life, God made my life good when I put all the pieces before him. I feel put back together. God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to God's eyes. Somebody ought to make a song about that. They ought to make a song. This praise goes on and on and on. Some of the last words of David in chapter 23. The oracle of David, son of Jesse, the oracle of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the God of Jacob, Israel's singer of songs. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. His word was on my tongue. The God of Israel spoke. The rock of Israel said to me, when one rules over men in righteousness, then he rules in the fear, the respect of God. That one is like the light of the morning at sunrise on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth. Is not my house right with God? Has God not made with me an everlasting covenant, arranged, secure and secured in every part? Verse 6, but evil men are all to be cast aside like thorns, which are not gathered in the hand. Whoever touches thorns uses a tool of iron and the shaft of a spear. They are burned up where they lie. Basically saying, don't get caught up in thorns. Don't get stuck by the thorns. Anytime you put your faith in a person before God, they're going to disappoint you. That's been my experience. Anybody else have that experience? They're going to disappoint you. But you can either stay stuck on that thorn of disappointment, or you can remove it and move on. Some of the most beautiful roses have thorns on them. I'm always worried about a rose that doesn't have a thorn. That's some strange gardening there. But we have that choice of going on and removing and stepping away from that. The rest of 2 Samuel is again talking about David's fighting men. Then he makes a mistake. He decides he has to count and see how many he has. God hasn't told him to count. God's just told him to use those people. What is there about people that we want to count? Sherry gets tickled because she catches me counting sometimes. I always count. I know how many people were here. I pretty much know which side had more people sitting. At Richard's funeral, as packed as this place was, I had almost to the number of people that were here. Why? I just do it. I don't even think about it. And I'll be looking around going, and everybody thinks I'm looking around smiling and praying for them. I'm counting. I'm counting a lot of times. But God had told David, why would God not want David to count his soldiers? Why would God not want David to count his soldiers?
I thought you were smiling because you liked us.
Pardon me? No, go ahead.
He would be tempted to recruit. I think he might be tempted to recruit more if he felt like he did not have enough based on what God had given him. If that's...
Yep, that's part. He also might have wanted to trust in the number instead of trusting in God. You know, God's not stupid. God knows what we need. Our problem sometimes is realizing what we need and what we want. I remember you say something about you're not too old for your wants to hurt you. I never quite understood what that meant. But I understand that God will provide what I need, not always what I want. Let's look for just a minute at the death of David. 1 Kings chapter 2. David has this son, Solomon. Did you read or do you know what David's one desire to do before he died, what he wanted to do? He wanted to build the temple. He wanted to build the temple. And God basically said, your hands are too bloody. You've done too many bad things, but I'm going to let your son do it. Now, what's really cool about this is God didn't allow David to build it, but he allowed David to make alliances and gather all kinds of things to build it. I can't imagine how frustrating it must have been. To have in his mind what he thought it was going to be, to get the things together, but no, he couldn't build it. David has to give some words of wisdom to his son Solomon, chapter 2. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. Remember, all through these people we've studied at different times, before they die, they call in their family. They call in especially their sons to give them instructions. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said, so be strong and show yourself a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in God's ways and keep God's decrees and commands, God's laws and requirements as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep God's promises to me. God promised David, if your descendants watch how they live, if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you'll never fail to have a man in the throne of Israel. That was that covenant God made with David. As long as your folks hang in there and do what they need to do, there's always going to be one on the throne. Now, you yourself know what Joab, he goes into all these different things that happened to him, to encourages him to show kindness to the other family members. Go down to verse 10. Then David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Now, if you kind of want, if you're interested, it's like, you ever watch one of these shows and you can't wait to see the next episode? That's how I am tonight with This Is Us, Channel 10, family one. They got this little baby, little 2-pound baby. I want to see what happens next. If you want to kind of see what happens next, go on and read on your own about Solomon and the building of the temple and the problems that Solomon gets into. The Bible is not full of perfect people. I find that comforting. Can you imagine this book if they only put all the good stuff in? I think that would make us feel intimidated, like we can't ever be good enough. But man, some of these people really messed up. And yet through it all, God reminded them of God's forgiveness and God's loving kindness. Tell me one thing throughout this whole saga of David that caught your attention. Just one thing. That he fought so many battles? What else?
That he could do something so horrible and God could break you up. That gives people that, a lot of people judge people, but it lets you know that you can do some really bad stuff, and as long as you ask for forgiveness, God will forgive you.
David did some very bad stuff, and yet God forgave him. God forgave him. I can't, if there's one thing about God, and there are many things I just can't fathom, it's how God can be so full of forgiveness. Not just the big bad things we do, but the little things we do over and over and over can still forgive us. What else?
And it's just kind of gives me a little hope, I guess. David did all these sad things, and it's a reiteration, I suppose, but God still used him to work for his glory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not only forgave him, but continued to use David. Continue to use David. There may have been times in your life when you think, okay, I have just messed up too many times. God is finished. And that's when God giggles and says, not yet. You still breathing? I'm not finished. What else? Anything else?
He was always so obedient. He was running from the king in the wilderness for how long? And he never, well, with the exception of Bathsheba, he
Except for that little thing.
yeah, he never failed to put what God wanted him to do first.
He understood God's priorities too, and he never failed to, like you said, not put God's things first. He could have killed Saul so many times and could have been rushed into being king probably before he was tried and true and ready yet. But he respected that. Our world doesn't have a lot of respect anymore. And people will ask me, especially people who have children, what do you want my child to call you? Reverend Catherine, Reverend Houchins, Pastor Catherine. And I say, the child can call me whatever you want to call me because their respect for me will not be based on my title. It won't be based on my title, it'll be based on the relationship I have with that child, based on the respect we have for each other. But David understood that with Saul. Saul was still the king, and as bad and crazy as he was, he still had to respect him as king. We could go off on some contemporary things on that, but we won't. Who else heard, thought, remembered anything that they got out of this? Man, next time we'll give you a little quiz like we did on the last one. I don't have a clue what we're going to study next. I've got 3 things in my office, 3 books in my office, and hopefully I'll be able to tell you by Sunday. But we're going to go to something that's a little more didactic in that meeting, that you're going to have some sheets to fill out some answers on, so that maybe you'll be encouraged to open your mouth and say something. But I've enjoyed this David story. It's a story that we think we know all the ins and outs of, but I've learned a lot of things about David through this study, and I hope you have too. Any last minute prayer requests, praises? Hearing none. Loving God, we thank you for the life of David so that we can see the ways in which he was continually faithful to you, and yet we see the ways that as a human being he strayed. And when he realized what Nathan was saying, he didn't argue, he didn't deny, he simply confessed. May we, in times when we need to confess, go back to that Psalm 51 and be willing to be as honest and open with you as David was. Keep us safe as we go forth, bring us back together on Sunday, and may what we learn here not just be mental, but be part of our very fabric of our spirit. In your name we pray. Amen.